Invincible is a show with many moving parts to its story, but it's very well written with a range of character arcs, awesome fights, and hype moments. So with a story like Invincible, it's no wonder that the community has questions as to what would happen if small changes were made to the story, which is why today we are answering hypothetical questions about Invincible. For example, what if Omni-Man killed Mark? What if Rex survived the war? What if Oliver wasn't born? You get the idea. And if you have any questions you want answered, be sure to leave them in the comments. But without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, the first question says, what if Mark had actually killed Omni-Man during their fight? If there was some alternate timeline where Mark was somehow strong enough to kill Omni-Man, there's a few things that would happen. First, without a doubt, is Mark would feel an immense amount of guilt and would probably be depressed considering the kind of person he is. He still loved his dad and he would not have wanted to kill him. And imagine Mark's first kill being on his own dad. He hasn't had his powers for that long at this point in time, so honestly this would have destroyed him. But after he eventually gets over himself, he would have to lock in and get to training because more Viltrumites are bound to come, as during this fight Omni-Man has said to Mark the truth about where he comes from. So I'm sure Mark would have figured out that more Viltrumites will come and try and take control of Earth. Anyways, the next significant thing that would change as a result of this will be that Oliver would never be born, and that would suck big time because I actually rate what Oliver brings to the story. He's a great character, he helped Debbie out of her depression, he always fights by Mark's side. I would miss him, and him not being there would change some things, like the Maulers would still be alive. But assuming the story continues in the same way and Viltrum send Anissa to fight Mark, hey, if Mark can beat Omni-Man in a fight, he sure as hell ain't losing to Anissa. Realistically, he's gonna beat her, but maybe he wouldn't kill her because Anissa's mission was never a fight to the death. She only came to try and convince Mark to join Viltrum. If she sticks to that mission, she would likely just run from the fight after she realizes how strong this version of Mark is. But the fight I'm most interested in seeing would be Conquest vs Mark, because a version of Mark that's strong enough to kill Omni-Man is definitely strong enough to fight Conquest one-on-one. And this would be a fight to the death just like the first time. But would he beat Conquest? I'm definitely leaning to say yes. Even more so if he has the help from Eve, because we saw her real potential in her fight with Conquest. So yeah, that's the major events I think would change, in my opinion, if Mark was able to beat Omni-Man in their fight. Alright, the next one says, what if Kate had actually died during her fight with the Lizard League? Oh, yes! Yes! See, this is the change we need. If Kate actually died in that fight with the Lizard League, we wouldn't have to deal with her foolishness anymore, because she is nothing but a nuisance. Nah, but for real though, if Kate actually did die, well, everyone else would have moved on pretty quickly except the Immortal, because he took it pretty hard and only stopped being depressed when Kate came back. So I imagine he probably wouldn't rejoin the Guardians for a while. Multipool still would have beat up Rex though, but Mark was going to stop him anyways, so he still would have ended up in jail and everything with that story still would have happened. But honestly, Kate just doesn't impact the story that much. Her usefulness in battle is not going to be missed. The Immortal would probably rejoin the Guardians like later in the future, as he would never have had a reason to leave in the first place, since the only reason he left was to start a family with Kate. But even he doesn't bring that much to the current Guardians. There's other people who can hit hard and fly fast. Alright, question 3 says, what if Mark actually killed Angstrom in their fight? Alright, this one would obviously mean that the Invincible War would never happen, meaning Rex would still be alive, as well as other heroes who died during the fight. But other than that, I don't feel like this would change that much about the story, for a while at least, until Angstrom returned. But that's way later in the comics, because Mark would still feel the same level of guilt and go through the same development when it comes to killing, because at that time, he really did think he had killed Angstrom. I think the more interesting question to ask is, what if Mark didn't intervene with Angstrom's plans in the first place? Because this whole thing with Angstrom going insane is technically Cecil's fault. He was the one who gave orders to Mark to stop the Maulers and Angstrom at the start of season 2, which was the catalyst for everything that follows. And I'm not gonna get onto Cecil for this, because when you see a bunch of clones sitting on this giant Christmas tree looking thing who are working with 2 criminals, the only logical thing is to stop them. But let's say Cecil had just let them finish. I guess what would have happened is Angstrom would have ended up with an immense amount of knowledge, because it was in this episode he was talking about how all the versions of himself have different experiences, some dimensions are super advanced, some of them have the cure for cancer, stuff like that. So had the experiment been successful, it probably would have been great for the advancement of society. I don't really see any downsides to this. Low-key, Cecil fumbled by giving the order for them to stop. Maybe this is a reach, but the only downside I can see is if Angstrom becomes like power hungry and decides he wants to use his knowledge he's gained for evil. But I doubt that, because Angstrom seemed like a really genuine guy who had the best interests of society at heart. There is a possibility that his memories get confused with all those versions of himself, leading to him going down the same path that he took in the current timeline. But the most likely outcome is that the experiment is a success, and he doesn't blame Mark for anything, and he uses his vast knowledge for good. I would have loved to see that, but instead we have Angstrom, who is like an insane villain. It would have been so cool to see the experiment as a success, and maybe later down the line spin him into a villain because he like becomes power hungry or something like that. I don't think the current Angstrom is poorly written or anything, but there was definitely more interesting spins his character could have taken. Alright, the next question says, what if Eve stayed under the government's control like she was originally supposed to? Well, Eve has always been the rebellious type and hesitant to be the government's weapon. So a version of Eve who obeys the government would have like an authoritarian personality and would more or less do as they say. So she would have been trained by Erickson and Brandyworth to use her powers properly, and she would definitely be a better fighter. I know we do see her fight with creativity in the special episode and in the season 3 finale, but let's be real, 95% of the time, Eve fights with like pink glass. She does not have good control of her powers right now. But had she been the military's weapon from the start, she would absolutely be a better fighter. But beyond her actual fighting ability, I'm more interested in her personality change, because Eve is like a happy girl, you know, she's quite easygoing, but someone who's trained to be the military's weapon, they always turn out to be like hardened in their approach. They become obsessed with being strong and have less grace towards the weak. I doubt she would exist to help people like she does now. Eve wants to help normal people live their lives in this world, but if she was the military's lapdog, she would only exist to serve their best interests. Never would she like go out of her way to fix buildings or save people unless it was on command. Her personality would really be more like that of a Viltrumite soldier, or maybe like a reanimator, and that would absolutely suck. The character depth would be completely gone. Yeah, she might be a better fighter, but we've already got enough good fighters, so it's a good thing the writers took this route on Eve's character, having her stray away from the government and find her own way as a hero, serving the people rather than serving the GDA. Alright, the next one says, what if Nolan and Mark had won the battle on Thraxa? So had Mark and Omni-Man actually succeeded in killing the 3 Viltrumites on Thraxa, then Omni-Man would have had 2 options, stay on Thraxa or go back to Earth. This is because it was Lucan who notified Viltrum to come to Thraxa after the fight ended, which is why they ended up capturing Omni-Man. But if they had killed him, he couldn't have done that. I think the most likely thing that happens though is Omni-Man and Mark stay on Thraxa for a bit to help out and continue to restore their relationship. Eventually Viltrum would send some soldiers to finish the mission though, and they would likely get into another fight, which could have ended up with Omni-Man getting captured and Mark being told by General Krieg to go back to Earth. But it's more likely that Viltrum don't send more soldiers if they don't know the threat, because they can't really afford to lose any more at this point. On the other hand, if Mark and Omni-Man do go back to Earth together, then we would just get the reunion between Debbie and Omni-Man earlier than expected. But I don't think Omni-Man would show himself in public or anything like that. There's just no way. They still see him as a murderer. Alright, the next one says, what if Conquest had come during the war? To be honest, Conquest would love that, because all he wanted was a good fight. So if he pulled up when a whole bunch of Invincibles are fighting, it just gives him more opportunities to dominate them. If he pulled up like right when the war started, he probably wouldn't have known which Invincible he was there to fight, and he would have ended up just fighting as many as he could. But would he solo the Invincible war? Probably, if he had fought a bunch of 1v1s, because he was not fighting Mark seriously in their fight. He was intentionally dragging it. But let's say he had to fight like a 2v1 or a 3v1, he might honestly struggle. I don't think he would lose, but he'd probably get like injured at a minimum before he finds the real Mark, and by then maybe Mark would have a better chance of fighting him one-on-one. But if Conquest arrived, let's say when the war was reaching its climax and it was only the 8 variants left, if he had to fight all 8, no way is he winning, not even if he locked in. And if Conquest was to die before Mark even saw him or find out who he was, that would definitely change some events later in the comics. Alright, this next one says, what if Omni-Man never left Earth? Well, the only way I see this happening is if Omni-Man had decided much earlier that he was going to abandon Viltrum for Earth, like before Mark even got his powers. So when Mark got them, Omni-Man would have never killed the Guardians, and oh my days, what a W this would have been. The OG Guardians were so much better than whatever the hell this team is. But my main question is, when would Viltrum realize that Omni-Man failed to complete his mission? Because they would never catch wind of Omni-Man's decision to abandon Viltrum and plot against them from anyone on Earth. And I don't think Omni-Man was in continuous communication with Viltrum during his 17 years on Earth. But considering how important Earth is to Viltrum, it wouldn't take them long to just send another soldier to Earth to finish what Omni-Man should have done. And when that happens, Omni-Man would probably fight, and maybe they'll have like a fight to the death. But if he kills that soldier who's just been sent to Viltrum, how long will it take for them to send another one? Who knows? But anyways, that's pretty much it for this video. If you guys enjoyed, let me know in the comments if you want a part 2. It was definitely fun to make, so be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.